All right, and both Brads can hear me. Brad Steckert, formerly Washington County, Wisconsin, and now part of Resource X, which is wonderful. And Brad Purser from Meridian, a convening of Brads. Well, hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. This is a training webinar where we're going to get into a discussion about prioritizing our capital budgets. I have a part of the presentation today, and Liz Johnston, who's with me, is also going to share some of the tips and a methodology and a framework for prioritizing as we've seen it in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, one of our client organizations. And then I'm going to wrap it up at the tail end with another case study, which is very exciting, about insights as it pertains to one-time investments and capital investments that we just went through with the city of Ann Arbor yesterday. So we'll have plenty of time as well for some Q&A towards the end of today's session, but we will get right into it. The agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to start the framework with why are we having this discussion of capital prioritization, and then we'll get into some of the more tactical approaches of what organizations are doing to prioritize. I thought it would be really interesting to share, if we just rewind the timeline to just a few months ago, putting a pause on our capital projects in March and April and May was seen as one of our major strategies to actually survive the operating shortfalls caused by economic impacts from COVID-19. This is a screen capture from GFOA's white paper, Cash is King, which was the essential tool in the toolkit for looking at cash flow challenges that many of us were facing and looking at all tactics on the table. Pausing capital spending was one of the main things that we all could resort to. I think we all also realized that it's a one-time bridge the gap type of solution, and now that has left us in a position to come back and start to reevaluate where do we go from here now that we've postponed or deferred some very needed maintenance projects and new construction. This Liz just pulled from the NLC survey showing 65% of municipalities surveyed had resorted to this kind of a strategy. And again, it was a needed strategy for so many of us, defer some capital in order to maintain core services. That's a type of prioritization overall. So we're here to talk about how do we pick up the pieces, how do we frame the conversation for prioritizing moving forward, and what are the consequences of continuing to defer capital projects, and then we'll get into some strategies on how to do it. I think this is common knowledge to you all, to hopefully our policymakers, but to put a pause on our capital projects while seeming like a solution to our budget shortfalls also has consequences, unintended to be sure. And one of them is realizing that for the projects that we might not have gone forward with, there very well could be contractors, there could be other partners who are depending on those projects to come through for their livelihoods. And it creates this kind of situation where you've solved one problem, we've worked our cash flow, stopped some of our one-time investments and balanced our own city or county budget. But the worry is we've now impacted our local economy, our contractors, our companies in such a way that perhaps some ramifications of that might be less revenue coming back into our systems later on, businesses continuing to struggle and needing more support overall. So being fully aware that the solution to the problem that we're trying to go after is not just limited to balancing our budget. Zooming out, we can start to see we solve one problem, we perhaps create another, and that's just worthy to keep in mind. Furthermore, as we think beyond the impacts to our local economy, you can start to think about deferring some of those capital projects doesn't mean we were able to escape the need for that investment. What I'm showing here are screen captures from things like the infrastructure report card from the American Society of Civil Engineers, who continue to come out and make sure that we're aware that we are already behind in our infrastructure investments, our bridges, our road infrastructure, our public transportation, our drinking water was already in need of a substantial investment, and therefore to defer or hit pause for one more year on some of these projects just exacerbates the problem overall. So at some point, we have to realize that, again, it was a much needed solution, bridge the gap for many core services that we needed to provide. Sometimes pausing a capital program is easier to swallow politically than imagining what a solution might look like from reducing services and personnel related expenditures. But also, again, while being aware that the bigger picture context is these investments will still have to be made at some point, and we have to start thinking about how do we catch up. As many organizations, NLC included, ICMA, have pleaded for further assistance that may come through and also might not come through. This comes from our discussions with Shane and GFOA. It's also imperative that we realize that some of that assistance is also one-time in nature. So even if we get to the end of 2020 or perhaps past the election and get into early 2021, and there still is some possibility for bailout resources, that's great. But we should also keep in mind that those are one-time investments that can help us for the near term, but we still have to address those long-term impacts of capital infrastructure investment. So I'm just trying to frame how we are starting to think about the problem that we're trying to solve, and knowing full well that on this call, we have current implementers of priority-based budgeting. So we have Edmonton on the line, we have Meridian, we had Tulsa on the line, we have Longmont, and a host of others. We also have some new organizations who have not gone through this. So we're going to talk about using this evaluation framework, this evaluation and prioritization framework that works completely well for our operating budgets and also has been shown to really help the conversation, get policymakers on the same page, and provide a consistent framework for evaluation for our capital expenditures as well. So we have two components that we're going to get into for the how section. And Liz is going to start us off with talking about how we can prioritize capital projects within a consistent framework using the case study from the city of Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. And following Liz's discussion, we'll have some time for Q&A in the middle there. I'll pick up and talk a little bit about a very recent experience just yesterday for how we can begin to imagine capital investments as a means to create cost savings a little bit down the road. So spending money to save money later, using the case study of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and what we've learned from one workshop thus far. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over reins to Liz. And while I do that, Teresa, to answer your question, yes, we'll follow up with a copy of this presentation right after the call.
Unmute. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I feel very fortunate to be presenting on this, and even more fortunate that I got to work with the city of Fort Saskatchewan on this project over the last few months. I really need to credit them with the realization that the processes that they had gone through with their operating budget would be very applicable and beneficial to them as they worked through their capital budget and that prioritization and presentation. We interviewed John Dance, who is the General Manager of Corporate Services in Fort Saskatchewan, several weeks ago as a part of our Resource Exchange interview series. And there is a segment that I have pulled out from that is pertaining to this. And that will be a part of the information that I send out following this meeting, is that recording of how they went through this process. But this quote that I have am probably abusing and throwing everywhere is directly from John. I don't think there is a better way to come up with objective scoring of a capital project. And they had the benefit of having the framework already set in place from their operating budget. And they chose to mirror that in a new model and associate that with their capital budget. But the end result was a data set of prioritized capital projects that were in varying degrees of alignment with the results that their elected officials had set for both the operating budget and the capital budget. So I'm going to work through just the process. And for those of you who are familiar with PBB, it is quite similar to that process. We start with data creation, then we get into data analysis, and then data application. On the data creation side, I would imagine many of you have a very specific set of projects that are in your budget and likely already have costs and revenue associated with those. So the data creation process is relatively simple, and you would reach that point of being able to act on that fairly quickly. We simply take your projects, put them into a template, and upload those into our online PBB tools. At that stage, you are able to not only name the project, but you have the opportunity to describe that project. And that description, which lives in online PBB and can be pulled out for reports and other such applications, but that would be an opportunity to fully describe what the project is going to accomplish. You could also state the resources that you think would be necessary, and then the impacts that you think that that project would have. We'll dive into other ways to do that as well, but this first data upload is an opportunity to capture it all within that project ID or project name. Once you've done that and we have your budget uploaded, you will then be able to allocate all of the resources that will go into that particular project to that project. And you have this amazing view that I do actually have online PBB open on my other screen, and I will get to that in just a moment. But you are able to not only view the total program cost, but you can dive into each project and see what makes up that total program or project cost. So that is the cost allocation step. Now, this is where we really get into the meat of why we believe that online PBB and the priority-based budgeting approach is so important to the capital budget prioritization process. And that is the scoring or evaluating of each project against a set of results or priorities that have been identified within your community. So once we have all of your projects into the tools, all of the costs associated with those, we go through two important steps to evaluate those projects. The first step is department scoring. This is where you can bring in those people who are the experts about that project, and they will go through and evaluate that project against these sets of results or priorities. We also have a set of scoring tools called our basic program attributes, which have proven to be very valuable in the capital budget prioritization process as well. There you can evaluate the level of demand, the level of mandate, the opportunity for partnerships through reliance. You can identify all of those through the basic program attributes, but then you can also evaluate against a unique set of results for your particular community. So you can say that a particular project is integral to the successful achievement of a safe and secure community. It is integral to the successful achievement of economic prosperity, just to use some examples. And that's a really important step to gather that subject matter expertise from a department owner or leader of that particular project. But then there's a second step that I think is crucial to the understanding of why you would propose to move forward with a specific project or not. And that's the peer review step. In the instance of Fort Saskatchewan, they did go through both of these steps, and they were able to glean an incredible amount of information just from the department scoring phase. And then they decided they did in fact want to continue through and do the peer review. And what this is a team that is constructed from all areas of the organization. And each of those teams is assigned a specific attribute or a specific result. And they become the subject matter expert for that particular priority result attribute. They then look through that lens at all of the projects that have been scored in that area and determine whether or not there was a consistent application of all of those important pieces of information within each result. But then they also just get to view and see if their understanding as somebody outside of that subject matter expert area agrees with that evaluation. So it really and truly does apply this consistency and fairness to the prioritization of each project. Following that peer review phase, you are then able to access not only an overall cumulative view of how the projects were aligned, but you still can go in and see the specific data points from each result or attribute. So you could say, I do not understand why a specific project aligned into a quartile 4 area versus a quartile 1 area. And then you can dig in and say, well, of course, it's very highly aligned with recreation and culture and with responsive economy, but there was no alignment to safe community or welcoming neighborhoods, just using some examples from Fort Saskatchewan. So you still have this incredible layer of data at each result or attribute, but then you also have the cumulative view. And that, I'm going to just go back a slide to this one. This is the cumulative view, where you can see in green, those would be the projects that fell into quartile 1, blue is 2, and so on through quartile 4. You can see here that you can view the differences between each of the differing phases. So the department scores are still saved and recorded, but then we also have that peer review analysis that is on top of the department scores. So you can click into either one of those to get down to that granular data. So this is the specific information, and then these are the reports that we are able to generate based on all of the information that is entered into online PBB. So for the presentation of a project, the presentation of the alignment of all of the projects, you will have this at hand, which includes all of the information about the project, what its total cost would be, what the overall alignment or quartile ranking was, and then each of the individual scores. So when you go in to have a conversation, you are equipped with all of this information. And I should point out that that was one of the biggest takeaways for Fort Saskatchewan, was by creating all of this data, they were armed with a considerable amount of information to communicate what the projects were. So to be able to put each project into an easily understandable format so that they could communicate internally with departments, but also with their elected officials, and then with the community after the final proposal of the budget. Okay, I think Chris is going to dive into the next level of information, but if we have any questions about the process, Chris, do you want to do that now? Cool. So any questions about the process or the tools themselves? And you can enter them in the chat or come off mute.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris, this is Brad Purser from Meridian. Just a quick question for you, or Liz. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Just so would this be alongside, if you do the normal, you have your general ledger, your financials, and that in one area, like is typically done with PBB. Would this be a different module, or would this just go alongside of what we've done with our financials? We'd have our program inventory, but then we'd have a project inventory too. And are they separate, or would they be together?
Chris, I'm happy to jump in unless you have an answer ready.
Go for it, and then I'll add anything that I have beyond what you say.
So, Brad, we have seen organizations do it both ways. And I would say from the perspective of analysis, having them in two separate models has proven to be pretty helpful. Our resource alignment diagnostic tools would then function separately with your capital budget versus your operating budget, and you wouldn't have those intermingling in that analysis phase. So I would say I've seen it done both ways. My recommendation would be to have a second model.
Okay. Beautiful. Thank you.
Sure.
I agree with that. And the main reason that I've seen it work better as a separate model is just when everything's kind of combined in one view of those quartiles. Obviously, the capital investments can alter or skew or confuse the conversation around, what's our programmatic prioritization look like in our spending array versus our capital spending array overall. It's just cleaner to see them separately.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree. That I like that very much.
And Brad, to your point and to Melody's, by having two separate models, you could have a different set of results, or you may choose to define the BPAs slightly differently to better serve the capital prioritization process. So by taking the capital into its own model, that would be another benefit should you have a specific result that you only wanted associated with capital, or a specific BPA definition that you wanted to exclude from the operating budget and apply only to capital.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. Because we have our strategic plan, and there are 6 or so items on there. All of those defined, and it's pretty well laid out. It would be interesting to see what we would limit, or how we would change that, or just it might be easier, like in our case, probably it'd be easier just to keep our results as is, but everybody does something slightly different, right? So
exactly. And the case study from Fort Saskatchewan is an example of a city that did choose to stick with the same results and same BPAs for both operating and capital. They do have two models, but they did stick with the same results and BPAs.
mm-hmm. Like
even looking at,
go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to point to what Liz has on the screen right there, that you're looking at the scoring criteria that Fort Sask used. This is from their report. So you can see the playground at Legacy Park is scored against the same basic program attributes, change in demand, mandate, population served, and their scores are right there. So they made it totally transparent. And then for results, Brad, and to Melody, you can see those are, maybe you wouldn't know it, but those are their community oriented results for that particular project that they were scored against. Other organizations like Branson, Missouri, and Kenmore, Washington, and Shawnee, Kansas, who have done capital scoring, it has been very consistent against their community-oriented results. And then, as Liz mentioned, maybe some tweaks in the BPAs. Another BPA that we've seen used is if you've already invested into a particular project, say it's a multi-year project overall, and they simply wanted to know, hey, if we've committed 2 out of 3 years of funding, that might make a difference. We would simply like to know that if we're thinking about pulling the plug. It would still be on the table for discussing if it landed in quartile 4 and you're wondering, why did we invest in this for 2 straight years? That was one really nice example of a BPA that lends itself well to multi-year projects.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you.
Melody, did that answer your question before we get to Joanne's from Edmonton about the pros and cons of the scoring criteria? Thank you. Perfect. Joanne, did you have a question still?
Hi, yes, I do. We're actually at this exact stage of presenting these reports for approval. So this is really timely and good to listen to. So my question about it was on the capital side. We're doing it on the operating side right now. So on capital, and I think maybe you just answered this, but are the basic program attributes different from capital than operating? And then, like I said, I think you just spoke to this before I kind of put my question in the chat, but the reason I asked was for the exact example that you said. We're finding that we had to address capital kind of offline, off of the PBB online tool, kind of in our own way, just the way that you know, our council motions rolled out and everything like that. So we had slightly different program attributes for capital, such as things like safety or how much funding had already been spent and things like that. So we refer to them as filters, but basically they are program attributes. So I just wanted to clarify if typically you would have 2 different sets of program attributes for operating versus capital.
Liz, certainly speak to your experience, for anybody from the Resource X team, speak to your experiences as well. Joanne, from what I've seen, while there is good reason where new attributes could be introduced, such as the multi-year project example, by and large, there's good reason to keep them consistent. You would ask yourself, if we're going to fund a capital project, wouldn't we fund it based on the same priorities, the same results we're trying to achieve, whether we're investing in a project or an ongoing program? And if the answer is no, then that's really interesting. That would cause you to say, well, what is the new scoring category? What is the new priority that is inconsistent? And that might lend itself well to an attribute. Another attribute I've seen is it's like an ROI attribute. I think Shawnee, Kansas, wanted to know if I invest $1 million into this particular project, I am anticipating it's an investment to change the particular way a region is developed, and I'm anticipating that it will yield greater return in the future. Sometimes you wouldn't see that kind of an attribute for a program. But I don't have, those are probably the 2 biggest examples that stick out in my mind. I don't have very many others that are really project specific that would be different.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I think the ROI example, that's somewhat similar to one of the ones we were assessing. For example, on the capital side, we would be looking at what the operating cost or operating impact is of that particular capital project. So that's very capital PBB specific, but not necessarily applicable if we were doing it on the PBB operating side, evaluating programs independently. So that would be like one example where I would see when we bring capital into PBB software, like potentially a capital specific BPA. So that's helpful. Thank you.
That's good. Great example. I think those are the questions in chat. This is how we like it to happen. So if you have more questions, please come off mute or type them in chat. And then I'm going to go back to sharing my screen here. And I'm going to show you a very recent hot off the press example of a case study from another organization where capital has come into play in a way that I did not expect. So many of you are familiar with the fact that after we put data together, our priority-based budgeting information, as Liz just mentioned, our program-based business intelligence on the operating side, we usually do that in order to then move into an insight phase, which is to say, we want to find out if we need new resources for something, how are we going to free up current resources that we have from the budget to fund? So repurposing becomes a major theme, and new revenue generation becomes a theme to fund priorities that we can't fund today. And that is the nature of our blueprint. If we need money to fund, to tackle a homelessness initiative or our climate action plan, or grapple with continued economic shortfall from COVID-19, we need the money here. Therefore, we have to come up with creative revenue generating strategies or resource repurposing strategies. This is what we usually work on. Yesterday, same framework with the city of Ann Arbor, in our focus on how can we free up new resources to fund a host of priorities that they don't have funding to provide, including climate, including COVID shortfall. We saw a number of insights being generated that were capital specific, and where it primarily was focused was spending one-time money today to create an ongoing efficiency later. So this is something in the approach to insight generation that we rolled out yesterday. It's part of a 3-workshop series where yesterday was all about looking at every ongoing program they provided and trying to identify a programmatic insight that could lead to resource repurposing or revenue generation. Next workshop, they're going to clean up those recommendations and prepare them for actual execution and approval. Whereas typically we see service level reductions or sourcing opportunities that come up, you are seeing here the number of insights. I think they're up to 67 programmatic insights that have been identified from, as exactly what I was just mentioning, program efficiencies that could be created, service level changes, cost recovery, partnership. And one more way that this is portrayed in the tools, we broke them out over number of insights that were short-term, near-term versus longer-term in nature. Could they be implemented quickly versus are they going to take some time? And then degree of complexity. Are they kind of easy no-brainers? We could do this tomorrow. We don't need decision-making authority to do it. Low complexity versus high complexity might need a council motion or a vote of the people. So they identified a whole host of opportunities, but where I was trying to get to was take, for example, here was one of their infrastructure programs, and we have the opportunity to tag the insight, again, with degree of complexity and the nature of the execution plan from a timeline perspective, as well as what is the recommendation. And then we would identify, okay, what sort of savings will come from this particular insight. And here is an example of updating mechanical control systems to improve efficiency and occupancy comfort. It's a reduction of energy costs. So it was a one-time expense. So it's a capital project. That's why I'm talking about it here. We started to see capital projects being identified as an insight, one-time investment in to change our use of energy that will create ongoing energy savings in the future. Really cool idea. Here's another one, very similar, but around smart cities and traffic lights, LED lights, energy savings through LEDs, savings on remote control and monitor of lights based on activity. This was really cool. There's a whole host of them, and this is just after one workshop where they're identifying new capital projects that will create a savings in the future. So Joanne, in a funny way, this does come back to your question on the basic program attributes, which is these are maybe one-time capital projects that we're not positive how they relate to results yet and how they would be scored. But the one thing we do know is that in this environment where we're scratching for new resources to the greatest extent possible, the Insight workshop was geared towards each and every idea to come up with new resources to fund unfunded priorities. And a number of the ideas happened to be one-time investments, capital projects. We saw this in Roswell, Georgia, where for their parks maintenance, they had, Ryan Luckett had a story of sensors in their parks that were measuring groundwater or soil saturation. And it was a one-time investment to fund this infrastructure, these sensors, but it was able to communicate whether or not they actually needed to water the parks or not. And the savings come from less use of water to water the parks. They perhaps were overwatering, or they could save money on all of their water use by purchasing these particular sensors. So I thought that was really interesting to bring up. While on the one hand, what Liz went through in the Fort Sask experience is all about prioritizing what we know to be one-time capital projects that need funding, and how do we have a common framework. The other side of the coin is, what new capital projects can we come up with will yield future savings and bail us out of the kind of challenges that we're facing. I'm going to go to the chat. I saw a couple things coming through. Just want to make sure. Ron has a question. One of our workshops is on a holiday. Ron, I might need, is that a future workshop that we're providing? Is that possibly, we're coming up upon a number of holidays, that's for sure. So it's very possible that we have some workshops on a holiday, if that's what you were describing. And then typical software that we see most people using. Yes, your next workshop is on Veterans Day. Oh man, we have some things on our schedule that we look out towards the future and try to piece them all in, but thanks for letting us know. And then in terms of a typical software, that is what we've been showing is the software that we provide, the ResourceX software, for identifying, cataloging all of your capital projects, and then being able to document, as Liz was going through, the costs. Is there a one-time impact? Is there an ongoing impact? Then other things that we might want to know about it, like, is it mandated, not mandated? Does it recover its costs or not? And then scoring and being able to talk about the relevance of those capital projects to council priorities and evaluating them on a common framework. That's definitely what we provide in our software tools. I'm happy to talk to you about that further down the road. Well, I'll pause here. Any questions on the Ann Arbor use of insights to come up with savings, to come up with new resources, and their identification of new capital projects along the way? Or any questions for Liz as well? I know, thanks Eric for posting some of the Fort Sask materials. So definitely welcome everybody to go see what is readily available from examples that you can take a look at.
And Chris, I will send an email following this with all of that information and then some more.
Sounds great. Joanne, go ahead. Yeah, take advantage. We have 18 minutes left.
I figured I might as well. On the capital side, I'm wondering if you encounter cities that have their capital budget structured in composite projects versus standalones, because we have, earlier when you were talking about importing all of your capital projects into the software, we have something called composites, where there are a bunch of tiny little projects that might not have specific budget details to the same level as some of our bigger infrastructure projects. And so I'm wondering if you have ever encountered that, because I just foresee that that's something we'll have to navigate in the future.
Eric Keck, you might have some things to suggest here. Joanna, is what you're describing, like, for example, on the programmatic side, on the operating side, we always harp on if a program contains what in fact are multiple programs, then try to break them out because it's easier to evaluate them each on their own merits in terms of their overall priority. And on the capital side, is it the case that you're coming across, like I'll make up an example, that there might be general roadway improvements that contain a host of smaller projects that you might be interested in evaluating each one by one?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. So in that example, if we had a project, but it was called general roadway maintenance, but we know that that consists of hundreds of specific roads in Edmonton, but we don't classify them as each individual project the same way we would as like a major bridge in our city. Just wondering, and so with that, you know, there's different levels of details when it's hundreds of streets and roads, and we may or may not have that level of detail for each and every road, but we kind of have higher level capital project and budget information. And I don't know that if you would drill down, would they have scored differently if we were looking at one road versus another? So just curious if that's ever been something you came across, because I just foresee that we'll come across that at some point.
And Joanne, my colleague Jackie just pointed out to me that you could potentially use the program group setting to tie multiple projects together. So that way they would still exist individually and would be scored individually. But when you were running a report or looking at them in the resource alignment diagnostic, you could stack them to see them grouped together.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Sure.
Joanne, I kind of forget, do you, the program grouping, are you familiar? I know you're brand new into all the tools. They're not brand new now, but that's a level of functionality that it's like you have department, division, and then we get to programs, and programs can be grouped and projects can be grouped at a different level than department or division. For example, we've had organizations say we want to know all of the community events related activities that take place. While at the program level, they might actually get down into celebration of Christmas holiday versus Easter versus other holidays that they have some local flavor, and then a category, a program group that we're describing could just be community events that you can attach all of those efforts to. You can do the same thing on the project side, it sounds like.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I haven't seen that firsthand or used it yet in the software, so that's good to know.
Cool.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Well, let's see. I did find Eric Keck says, I did find that I had to break out projects to better score them when I was managing in Inglewood. You'll experience an ebb and flow of rolling up and breaking out programs over time. That's normal. That's a great point. You'll come to what's too big and what's too small is always an ongoing part of your evolution with the data on the programmatic side and on the project side. Eric Keck, having done this twice in 2 different cities, has a wealth of experience. And thanks for sharing that, Eric, that it is something that will ebb and flow. That makes a lot of sense. Cool.
So the the criteria you use when you're scoring, do you not want to get into that more specifically about what it is? I mean, that's where I was getting, I guess, getting a little confused.
Gotcha, Teresa. So we have shown some examples. The questions that were coming in earlier about what results do you score against and what basic program attributes, that is vocabulary that is common for organizations who have been through this before. But to make sure that you see what we're talking about, I'm going to open this up a little bit. So let me know if I'm hitting the mark here, but for every project that is identified, you're looking at something called result type. This is a scoring approach. And we're coming up with all of the evaluation criteria that would help you or your elected officials say that this project is a higher priority than another project on the list and so on. And that's the approach to say, if we only had so much funding, we would fund our highest priority items and we'd run out of funding at some point, and the projects at the bottom of the list would not receive funding. So the types of evaluation criteria that we're talking about, there are basic program attributes and there are results. Basic program attributes are things like, are we seeing that this project is mandated, and to what degree is it mandated? So an example would be, we break it out in the tools of a high degree of mandate would be something required of you from the federal government. So for example, if you have an improvement to your wastewater treatment plant that is required because there are new Clean Water Act regulations that are coming down, and you need to make that upgrade to your infrastructure to abide by these new federal regulations, that would be a high score for mandate. Versus if you have a capital project to replace or refurbish some local playground equipment, that might not be federally regulated. It might not even be state regulated, but a third level down might be, it's in your own code. That's a form of a mandate, that you want to maintain playground equipment to a certain level. And then all the way down, we have not broken all of these scoring categories out for this presentation, but I'm just giving you a sense for what these categories are all about. And we'd absolutely be happy to follow up with you to give you some more behind the scenes detail on what are the scoring categories for mandate, for population served. Cost recovery is another, degree of reliance is another. Are you the only possible provider of this project, or can somebody else do it? And then beyond those, what we call basic program attributes against which all projects can be scored, you get into results, which are more analogous, I think this is what Melody from Longmont was asking about, to what's in your strategic plan. Alignment with what your elected officials and citizens say are the outcomes you're trying to achieve for your community. And they tend to be things like a safer community, a healthy economy, healthy and prosperous people, infrastructure, and so on. And it's the cumulative scoring of all of these projects against that criteria that Fort Saskatchewan went through in order to prioritize their limited funding. That was their common framework. That's a super crash course, but am I hitting the mark with what you're hoping to learn more about?
That's what I was trying to understand.
Okay. Great. I think even in the Fort Sask link, if you go to their website, you will start to see some of these categories spelled out even in a little bit further detail. We're also happy to follow up with you and talk about how, what you're facing in your community.
Great, thank you.
Sure. All right, we're in the crunch time, 8 minutes left. Anybody else have some burning questions on capital or some general strategy they wanted to talk about or experiences to share?
Well, I don't know anyone on this call, but I'll talk since it's silent. I am, not only have I been in local government for 40 some odd years, and I'm 59 years old and could retire anytime. I'm just now finishing my master's in public administration, and my capstone project is on prioritizing capital projects because I'm sick of doing a CIP every year and it's void the next day after they approve it because they've moved stuff around or they've spent something or they've done something. So in my research project 6 months ago, that's what I started on. And I'm just trying to, I've got so much information, I can't figure out how to pull it all together on what's the right thing to do. I'm doing more of a grounded theory paper because it's more practical to me than the other. And I was pleased to see that you were going to talk about this and that this is another tool out there for people. We just now started using Planet software to do our CIP, and they have a prioritization part in there, but all we really did was basically prioritize it the same as the years that we have them spread out there. We didn't do much else. And then we always end up just saying, well, this is all the money we're going to spend. So now what are you going to do? So that's been our method. And I've never really thought that that was the best method. So I was trying to come up with something better. So.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, let us know when your paper comes out. That'd be cool. We wanted to see if given, you know, more needs, more projects than resources. If you have infinite resources, you don't need to prioritize anything. But absent infinite resources, how would an organization come to agree that certain projects should receive the limited resources when compared to others? And that is the background for saying, well, this seems like a reasonable rubric. As Eric Keck had mentioned, we ought to know these are categories that might matter to us. We're abiding by a federal mandate. So let's score these projects relative to that kind of category. One of them is receiving grant funding. It has cost recovery, whereas another one is going to absorb all of your general fund, general government resources. That might make a difference in what programs you approve. And then finally, how does it impact your community? What matters to your people? Would you fund a project that has a high degree of impact and alignment with all of the priorities of your society over a project that has less to do? And that's the basic idea behind this type of prioritization rubric. Cool. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. We will, in the spirit of reallocation, we will reallocate 4 minutes of your time, and so that you will not be facing scarce resources when it comes to your next meeting. But thanks a lot. We'll follow up with the slides and materials and also post this presentation out there. For those of you who are new, we continue to do these webinars basically every Wednesday, whether it's an interview with a special guest on our resource exchange. I think next we have Shane Kavanaugh from GFOA is coming up soon, very soon, next week. And also try to have some practical application of PBB data and the tools to share our experiences with others. So thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to staying in touch. Take care, everyone.
And Liz, good to see you again.
Thanks, everybody.